This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Welcome to today's meeting of the Housing Committee. Members of the public may like to follow at London Assembly on social media and use the hashtag London Housing for this meeting. Please may I remind participants to silence all your devices. Our main item of business today is a discussion on accessible housing in London. Before we begin, though, we have a few short items of business, and can I ask our clerk, Diane Richards, for any apologies received?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for absence have been received today from Assemblymember Moema, for whom Assemblymember Baker will be substituting, from Assemblymember Small-Edwards, and also from Assemblymember Lord Bailey, for whom Assemblymember Garrett will be substituting today.
Great, and thank you for all the substitutions. So we're just going to run through a few items of business. So declarations of interest, can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other items to declare? Noted. Great. Thank you. So we're taking items 3, 4 and 5 together. So can you note the committee's membership, the chairing arrangements and terms of reference, and the standing delegations of the authority to me as chair as agreed by London Assembly on 6th of May 2025? Thank you. Can you confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 26th of March 2025? Can we note the completed and outstanding actions arriving from our previous meeting and the additional correspondence sent and received? Just noting. And then action taken under delegated authority. So can we note the actions taken by me and the former chair under delegated authority in consultation with group party lead members, namely to agree all the great reports that we put out. So the committees Building Community Power, Expanding Cooperative Housing and Community Land Trusts in London, the committees Breaking the Cycle, Housing Needs for Women Leaving Prison in London report, and the committees Worried and Stress, Life as a Leaseholder in London report. So can we note those? Noted. Great. And I just wanted to take this moment to say a thank you to our outgoing chair, Sen Moema, for her chairing and oversight of this committee with some really excellent outputs. And just finally, the response to the committee output. Can you note the response from the Mayor of London to the committee's investigation into the financial sustainability of the housing sector? Noted. Excellent. Thank you. Right, on to the main part of business. So this brings us to our main item, so accessible housing in London, something I'm really excited that we're looking at today. So this morning's panel is split into 2 discussions. So currently this morning we have with us, and can I please welcome Suzanne EY, disabled co-producer living in Hammersmith and Fulham, Hallie Banish, campaigns and communications manager at I don't actually know how to rules, and Laura Vicenanza, senior policy and stakeholder engagement manager at Inclusion London. I'm going to start with the first question, then I'll go to the Assembly members for other questions, and we'll move through. And we're aiming to go until about 11:15. So, to all of you, what are the key challenges faced by deaf and disabled Londoners in finding suitable housing? And Laura, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So, deaf and disabled Londoners face huge challenges in finding suitable housing. Just wanted to say that we've got 1.6 million disabled people in London, and everybody is different. So everybody's got different housing access needs, so everybody will experience housing challenges slightly differently. But I can say that the biggest challenge of all that disabled people face in London is finding suitable housing, accessible housing that meets our needs. But also finding homes that people can afford. So these are the 2 biggest challenges that people face. And also, I just wanted to highlight that when I talk about disabled people, I don't just talk about wheelchair users or people with mobility impairments, but with Inclusion London, see disabled people as people with different kinds of impairments, so neurodivergent people, people with long-term health conditions, people with visual impairments, sensory impairments, and so on and so forth. We know there are many deaf and disabled people in London who are stuck in homes that are totally unsuitable, that don't meet their needs. Some people have to wait years, sometimes decades, for suitable homes, particularly in the social rented sector. And that's because there aren't just enough accessible homes being built. And also we know that most of the existing housing stock is not accessible and can be adapted to meet disabled people's needs. So we have conducted some research over the past few years. We released a report a few months ago called Barriers at Home. And one of the key findings of our report, of our qualitative research, is that one in four disabled Londoners live in homes that are totally inaccessible. That means that they can't even use basic facilities in their home, like kitchen, bathroom. They can't even get in and out of their home, which is frankly unacceptable for us. And what we found is that, for example, if I can give you some example, a lot of people don't have bathrooms that are accessible because, for example, they don't have a wet room or they don't have grab rails. Their kitchen is not accessible either. And because, for example, cupboards are out of reach for a lot of wheelchair users. These are just some examples. Actually, we found that 1 in 3 people with mobility impairments don't have level access, which means they literally can't safely and independently get in and out of their home. And yeah, that's quite shocking. But apart from the physical accessibility, I think one of the key challenges a lot of people face is finding homes that meet, that have, for example, noise-reducing insulation, adjustable lighting, thermal comfort, a good layout design. So when we talk about accessible housing, we don't just mean homes that are physically accessible, if you've got a ramp or not. We want homes that they are accessible for people with different kinds of impairments. So we literally spoken with people with visual impairments who told us that they ended up walking into cupboards in their homes because they didn't know, they couldn't even use their white cane, for example, and because the lighting wasn't appropriate. A lot of people with neurodivergent struggle with noise, for example, and that kind of is a huge disabling barrier for a lot of people. Deaf people and people with hearing impairments don't have flashing doorbells or flashing fire alarms, which is a huge issue for fire safety if you're a deaf person, if you don't have. And actually, some people told us that when they had flashing fire alarms and they broke, the landlords didn't actually end up repairing them. So these are some of the issues that we uncovered through our report and are big challenges. But another big challenge for a lot of disabled people is not just finding a home that is accessible, but also finding a home that is accessible in an accessible area. A huge challenge that a lot of people have is over half of the people that responded to our survey told us that their area is located in an area with poor inaccessible transport links. For example, they haven't got a step-free access tube station. There is no bus stop nearby that they can use. Shops nearby are not accessible. There are no healthcare facilities. The street space is not accessible. For example, there are no dropped curbs or uneven pavements. And we literally had people telling us that they had to refuse accommodation that was allocated to them because it was allocated in an area that was inaccessible. So that's a huge challenge that a lot of non-disabled people don't experience. And then I guess a big challenge, as I was saying earlier, is affordability. A lot of disabled people struggle to afford their housing costs. We found that a lot of people spend over 50% of their income on rent, and the majority of these are disabled private renters. And also 1 in 3 people had to cut back on essentials, on food, electricity and gas to be able to afford their rent. I don't think anybody should make these choices, right? But that's unfortunately the reality a lot of disabled people live. I'm going
to just ask you to
summarize.
So we can just go on to the other.
The last thing I want to say is security of tenure. I think for a lot of disabled private renters that we spoke to, what also matters is not just that the home is affordable, but it's also secure. So they want to feel they're unable to live in their home long term, but that's often not the case for a lot of disabled private renters.
And we've got lots of great questions to follow up on those. Thank you so much, Laura. You can tell how deep that research was, and I really appreciate the work that Inclusion London have done. I'm going to move on to Hallie.
Thank you. It's Hayley, but it's okay. It's spelled like Hallie, so it's totally fine. So I work with the Deaf and Disabled People's Organisation working in Southwest London, and one of our services that we provide is complex casework, specifically around housing, benefits and social care. And I just want to make the point that housing is interconnected with all of those and many other facets of people's life. And I think a massive barrier is that those areas of people's lives are not talking to each other. So other organizations, and so many of the people that come to us that are in inaccessible housing, or they can't find housing that is appropriate to meet their needs, have a myriad of other issues that they are encountering. So on top of not having the basic housing needs met, they are inundated with other things that they are having to think about. And often we are working with people 1, 2, 3 years to find the right solution for them, not just housing, but with their benefits and their social care. And I think the link between affordable and accessible homes is a massive issue. There are not enough affordable, accessible homes. Primarily our work is in Richmond Borough, which is 50% green space. There are not enough homes being built, and certainly not enough accessible homes to meet the demand. And I think for us, what we're having to go back to clients and say is, we're so sorry, there just aren't homes for you. And people are then being displaced from their communities. They're being displaced from their support structures, vital health services, education, and being put in temporary accommodation to wait for appropriate housing to be built. And often that appropriate housing does not come fast enough. Again, we see people waiting 2-3 years in temporary accommodation that isn't meeting their needs, right? So not only do they not have a long-term secured accessible accommodation, but then they are living in and out of hotels. They're being moved every 2 to 3 weeks. They may not be able to use the loo. We had an example of someone who was living in a Travelodge and needed to be in an accessible room, but there were no accessible rooms available to them. So not only are people not having that basic need met, they're sitting in limbo for a really long time, and that massively impacts their life and their well-being, and causes health problems, mental health problems, can exacerbate comorbidities, if they have long-term health conditions. So, just want to make the point that, this is all interconnected.
Thank you. Suzanne?
I'm disabled across the thing of neurodivergent mobility, and I represent people at White City and in my borough, both as a local resident and as somebody working with the council on inclusive design review panels for new developments and the built environment around it. And our problem is intergenerational, really. My estate's 100 years old, and what was accessible when some of us first moved in is now not accessible for us now, because there's a limit to the adaptations that can be done. And the data that actually assesses what we actually need is out of date, because it is not collected by us, the disabled people. It's collected by central government or by census or by means that have nothing we don't relate to. So since COVID, we've got 3 generations living under one roof. We've claimed older people back from accommodations outside London, and we've had new diagnoses for disability in that period of the last 5 years. So if the data was collected by us, we'd be up to date with the accessible needs. I, for instance, am under-occupying a flat that could go to a disabled family. 80% of my family are actually neurodivergent with different needs. One of us is actually housed according to our needs, 2 of us are not. And that includes someone living in a new build, which he now considers to be unsafe and to live in. So you can build it, but is it operationally safe? Is it overheating people? And was that explained, so that if you relate that back to affordable rent, the service charge for district heating and other fancy goods that are in there that actually are not operationally sound, put people into economic crisis, and then most of those people in new builds that are supposedly accessible are on 1-year probationary rent tenures. So if they don't fulfil that and they come adrift, then they'll be put back into temporary accommodation. And we've got an absolute bottleneck of people, both in temporary, people who've had to be moved for damp and mould out of new builds at Old Oak that proved to be unsound. So accessible really is defined by it being sustainable, durable, safe to be in, and then, as been mentioned, the context of where you are. Our old people won't surrender their accessible flats that they're under occupying until they're given something they feel safe in that is accessible wherever that is. But most people cling to their medical support. If that medical support's in the area, then they need to have their tenure and their accessible home in that area. So we have data that isn't there for those bottlenecks of housing. And I sit on that inclusive design review panel trying to say to people there are other solutions to putting in mechanically ventilated heat recovery systems. They're expensive for the tenants to run. If you build like my 100-year-old flat with like casement windows or curved windows where you can have airflow, even if it's single aspect, then it's accessible in terms of people who suffer from SADS, people who've got people who are housebound who don't go out and still need to feel as though they have sight of greenery, have a balcony they can grow things on. So the list of what accessibility features goes far beyond what an architect thinks is. And while we don't have inclusive design access consultants on developments working with us, and on my last point, is such a thing as development fatigue. Just because you can see land grab within an area, if that area is being developed over a 25-year period, which is what I am experiencing, the drift of construction and the impact on people who don't need to move is considerable, and it causes fraction within the communities and causes the disabled person to feel that when they're asking for accessible housing where they live, that they're asking other people to suffer on their behalf. And there's no guarantee that what's accessible that's been built on your doorstep you'll have a right to be in.
Thank you so much. You've all really eloquently described the situation. I know we've got some other questions to dig deeper and you've got lots of more opportunities to speak. I'm going to go to Assemblymember Baker for the next question.
Thanks, Chair. So I think all of you have started to touch on my question, but I'll give you the opportunity to expand on it, which is what is the impact of deaf and disabled on deaf and disabled Londoners of not having an accessible and affordable home. So I know we've started on that, but really want to dig into that. Hayley, did you want to kick off?
Absolutely. I think, as you said, I already said, I mean, massive impact on health and well-being. We are seeing people with exacerbated mental health, poor mental health, I don't want to say it's necessarily happening just because of the inaccessible home, because it's all interconnected. But when you don't have a safe and accessible space to go home to, if you have a long-term health condition that limits your ability to go out and about or to be independent or to access your basic services that you need, you know, the impact is going to exacerbate your health condition. I think also there are additional costs that come when you are living in something like temporary accommodation, when you're waiting. So if somebody's living in a hotel and they don't have access to a kitchen, for example, their meal costs are going to go up significantly. I gave the example of one of our clients who's in a Travelodge and they needed to be in an accessible room so that they could access the shower, but unfortunately there wasn't one available, so they just had to take what they could get. So they're spending more money on hygiene items because they can't actually take a proper shower. And I think the Inclusion London report talks about this really eloquently, better than I might say it, but feeling like you're a valuable part of the community and that you have worth, the impact there is massive. Feeling like, you know, you might be an extra burden, or on the other side, if you haven't had a shower in 2 weeks, you're not going to want to go outside. You're not going to feel very good about yourself. And the final point I make about the impact is there is a big trend that we're seeing, and we are absolutely inundated with people who cannot navigate the systems in which they're meant to go through to get accessible housing. So people, it's too complex, it's overwhelming, they're already having to deal with all of these other things, and suddenly they're just expected to be knowledgeable about how to get accessible housing, whether that's through private renting or through social housing. And our caseloads are full of people who need help. So it's not just the impact on the individual, it's the impact on the wider disabled community and also all of the support services in the voluntary sector, which are under immense stress and pressure at the moment. So it's an individual and systems-wide impact.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Suzanne, did you want to come in on that?
My son's autistic and he has two friends that work for 111 and they've been taking calls, not necessarily medical related, but from people living in temporary housing, people living in house shares, people who going into suicide ideation because they know what the registration thing is to go and get an accessible home. Some of them have moved away from parents because of study and have stayed here in London but find that they can't get an accessible home. And because most of those are neurodivergent and they feel their voice isn't heard, then they go to charities and they try and sit with them through the winter cold. But they're not doing very well, some of them. And when my son hears stories like that, it takes him back to the worst of his before he was housed. And he feels that he's very much obliged to represent the other disabled residents in his building for those accessible units. But they've had such problems with the operation of facilities within their home that they've had to come and knock on his door, knowing that makes them anxious because he doesn't really know them that well. He wrote a report on the flaws within the stuff and the impact that everyone was suffering in their building, including the fact that they didn't have a name and their support workers couldn't find them. And it's still 16 months along the line, they still don't have a name for their building. Everybody thinks it's part of the school because it's built over a school. And in my walking around my estate, and I'm vice chair of the Residents Association, I actually encounter people like me, under-occupying, waiting to move. And I ask them how they are, and they're just waiting for their husband to come back to lift them 2 floors up because they can't climb the stairs. I ask them how long they've been waiting, and it's over 2 years. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. And then I've got other people in temporary accommodation that have been there over 15 years. And if there's something happens in their flat, they don't know what to do if they're impacting on somebody else living underneath them that's disabled, like the flooding that's happened to me, because they don't know when they're going to be moved. I've had to help an autistic family actually get rails put into our building to adapt it so that her blind son, who's autistic, could actually walk up and down the stairs to get to school. And the amount of interventions that we have to do as a residents' association to actually reduce the impact on people looking for accessible housing, people living in so-called accessible that isn't accessible anymore, just goes on and on. And stories make me weep. There was a story said in front of our cabinet member for housing, and the only people that got in the room, got up to help that lady because she fled the room in tears, was people from the Residents' Association and one councillor. And the councillor sitting in the room was a cabinet member for housing. That's how poor I think some of the support is for people suffering from the impact of being in accessible housing.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that. Laura, I know that the experiences were woven into your first answer, so is there anything you want to sort of bring out or add to what's been said?
Yeah, so I just wanted to add that the impact of not living in an accessible and affordable home is actually devastating for a lot of people, both physically, mentally, but also like emotionally, as my colleagues were saying. We've spoken to people who live their life in one room. They wash, they eat, they sleep in one room because the other rooms are not accessible. People who can't shower or cook independently without relying on carers or partners, right? That's the reality that a lot of people face because their bathrooms and kitchens are not accessible. And a lot of people also told us they leave their homes less often because they can't really get in and out of their front doors. So there is also this kind of feeling of loss of independence and social isolation as well. A lot of people end up isolating themselves. But also, a lot of people injure themselves because in order to perform daily tasks, they have to move their bodies in such a way but the home is inaccessible. So, inaccessible housing doesn't just have the huge negative impact on people's physical health. It does take a huge toll on people's mental health. The amount of people we spoke to that experience stress, anxiety, depression, that had to be hospitalized, it's just outrageous. And I would like to bring to the attention of the Assembly of a case of a disabled tenant who was renting from Clarion Housing Associations a few years ago. This tenant was basically complained to Clarion about the level of noise in his flat, and his GP warned the housing association that this person was tried to commit suicide twice, and the housing associations basically told him that he was whining, that he couldn't expect silence if he wanted to live in London. And after 9 months of complaints to the housing association, this person finally took his own life. So that's the situation, right, that people are living in. And it's not just about, as I was saying, living in a physically accessible home. It's about people lacking even those inclusive housing design features that we expect all new build developments to have, right? And we expect also buildings to be retrofitted so that they can have, for example, noise reducing insulation and so on. But I guess what I wanted to highlight is also the impact of not having an affordable home. A lot of people are having to cut, and I was saying this earlier, are having to cut back on essentials, on gas and electricity. But I just wanted to say that a lot of disabled people, for example, pay for therapies that are not available freely on NHS, like oxygen therapy, physiotherapy, heating. If you need to charge your mobility equipment, you've got a mobility scooter. That means that your housing, your cost, your electricity costs are going to go up, right? So people are having to make decisions between literally heating their homes and eating, and that's not acceptable from our perspective. And also, when we spoke with disabled people living in the private rented sector, they told us that they constantly feel this kind of sense of instability because they can get evicted, the landlords can hide the rents without fault of their own, and all of these generates a lot of stress, anxiety, and it does have a huge impact on people's physical health. The last thing I wanted to add is that we don't have to forget that living in inaccessible and affordable homes doesn't just have a negative impact on disabled people, it has an impact on wider society. There are plenty of studies that show that inaccessible housing is linked with poor employment outcomes. Literally, the Equality and Human Rights Commission said this a few years ago. Living in inaccessible housing means that disabled people are 4 times less likely to be in employment. So we've got now a national government who's trying to say that disabled people need to get into work, cutting disability benefits, and we haven't heard about accessible housing. And accessible housing is a huge problem for a lot of people, and that's why they can't really get into work. And if I can add as well, a lot of people are more relying on social care because if the homes was accessible, they could live more independently. They wouldn't have to rely that much on social care, and they are hospitalized even more, right? And so if we're also keen to reduce hospitalizations, we need to invest in accessible housing and make sure that people can be discharged from hospital, because a lot of people can actually be discharged from hospital, not because they are too unwell, but because they have completely unsafe homes to return to that they don't get discharged. So just wanting to give a wider picture and say that accessible housing is not just for disabled people, it's for everybody, because everybody is going to get old at some point in their life, and we've got an aging population. So failing disabled people means failing society overall. I just wanted to add this. So we really need to make sure that we tackle this crisis for the benefits of everybody. Thanks.
Thank you, Laura.
Thanks very much. Thank you, all of you, for those answers. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing that, Laura, at the end about the importance of this within the wider responsibilities. And I just want to say I do remember the case that you described, and it's absolutely heartbreaking, and just wanted to say that to anyone listening, if you're finding any of this difficult, you can seek support from Samaritans and other agencies, because I know that I expected this to be quite heavy in terms of how it impacts disabled Londoners. I'm really happy that we're having this conversation and bringing these experiences into City Hall so we can think about how we address them. Assemblymember Cooper for the next question. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to turn to what more you would like the Mayor to do to support the delivery of accessible homes in London? And perhaps if we start with Laura and then we'll work along and see what you all think about that. What else do you think the Mayor and the GLA could do?
Thank you for the question. So please stop me if I talk too much because I have a lot to say on this. So please tell me. So we know that there is a shortage of accessible housing across all housing tenures, but specifically the shortage is acute in the social rented sector, especially when it comes to wheelchair accessible homes. So from our perspective, what we really would like, the Mayor and the GLA to do is definitely boost the supply of accessible homes, particularly in the social rented sector. And we want to see more new build accessible homes, but also we want to make the most of the existing housing stock and trying to see whether we can retrofit as much as possible existing homes to the highest possible accessibility standards. So that's what in general we would like to see more. In terms of specific sort of changes, for example, to the London plan, the biggest issue that we uncovered through our report is the lack of data on deaf and disabled people housing needs and lack of data on the accessibility of the housing stock. So we know that most councils actually don't know about disabled people housing needs. They don't know how many accessible homes they are building, what level of accessibility these homes have been built to. We've submitted a lot of freedom information requests, and when we got the responses from councils, that's what it basically showed. And also they don't know how many accessible homes are actually affordable, so they don't have granularity of data, for example, about whether counts, for example, an accessible home is in social rent or is London living rent or shared ownership or even rent, market rent or for sale. This kind of information is not available. Only 2 councils provided us with a complete tenure breakdown of their approvals and completions for new build accessible homes. So that's what we found through our research. At the same time, also the GLA on data are not particularly accurate. The evidence base in the SHMA is not sufficiently robust. There is a lot of lack of data in the SHMA. The SHMA, for example, doesn't really say much about the current and future demand for accessible housing. It doesn't say much about the existing housing stock. We don't know, for example, how many homes are visitable and built to M41, M42, and M43 homes, whether the existing housing stock can be retrofitted to meet disabled needs. So there is a huge issue with data. So definitely what we would like to see is for the GLA to monitor accessible housing starts and completion by tenure, because as we were already saying earlier, we really need to monitor where these accessible homes are built, what kind of tenure, and we believe that housing providers, registered housing providers, should be required to collect data on the accessibility level of the homes that they are building under the Affordable Homes Programme, for example, because they are required to build homes to accessibility standards. And the SHMA should... Can I
just... Sorry to interrupt you, but when you said registered housing providers, you were talking quite a lot about local authorities. Did you manage to get any better data from housing associations who've obviously undertaken a lot of the new builds and have produced a lot of the newer social rented housing since, the mid-1980s? Is there better data from housing associations on accessibility?
So I think somebody wants to come in on this point, but I guess...
Well, I'm gonna ask all three of you, but so don't worry, I'm just wondered if I could follow that up with you.
Yeah.
And the more detail, when you say there's not enough detail, if you could just be very specific, because obviously the way that we work is, as a result of this meeting, we will then potentially write to Tom Copley and say, we think your staff need to do more in area X in collecting this data. It's more difficult for us to tell local authorities to do that, obviously, seriously, even from the Housing and Land team here, because they've had to cut a lot of staff, as you know, because they're very constrained in terms of their budgets. But I just wondered in terms of the housing associations.
So I can come back to both your questions. So housing associations we can't submit freedom of information requests to a housing association, right? Is it? So we don't have data from housing associations, and so to answer your questions, but from the people that we spoke to, I mean, you talk to them that do more like borough level work. I don't think the housing association have this data. In terms of what, I mean, I was trying to be quick, but I'm happy to explain exactly what we think is missing from the SHMA. So the SHMA doesn't give any indication of impairment types of people who need accessible homes. You need to know how many wheelchair users, right, require wheelchair accessible homes. You need to know how many neurodivergent people there are in London. You need to know how many people who are deaf, how many people with certain condition. That information isn't in the SHMA, right? Then there is no indication of how many people need, for example, M43 homes, wheelchair user homes, M43B, wheelchair accessible, wheelchair adaptable, accessible and adaptable. That information is not there. And there are no projections of how many disabled people and other people might need these homes in the future. And then also, there is no information about the accessibility of the housing stock. The SHMA doesn't have any information about how many existing homes are visitable, accessible or adaptable, wheelchair accessible, whether the stock can be retrofitted, and what kind of improvements will be needed to make sure that the homes are accessible. And also doesn't even say about the areas in which some disabled owners might require more accessible homes. All of this is currently missing from the SHMA. And because the SHMA ends up informing the London Plan and the housing strategy, we believe this information should be collected.
Thank you. Hallie, the same question about what more would you like the Mayor, the GLA to do to support the delivery of accessible homes, and what changes, if any, would you like to see in the London Plan, but hopefully not covering the same ground that Laura has just gone through for us.
Absolutely. I agree with everything that Laura said. Data.
Well, that's good.
Data.
That's good.
Yes.
That's good.
I think more kind of broadly and generally, like, build accessible and affordable homes right the first time. And I know a lot of this goes down to like local authorities, choosing contractors and actually delivering. But there seems to be a lack of accountability for the delivery of accessible homes, particularly when we're seeing on the ground big promises of developments delivering a certain percentage of accessible homes in their in the kind of new projects, but the actual reality of that, when those projects are finished, does not match what has been promised. We're seeing this time and time again. We're also seeing...
So just unpack that slightly. So people are developers or housing associations, whoever, are promising to include 10% of the 150 units or whatever it is should be fully accessible. So anybody in a wheelchair could use them. I'm trying not to use all this private code that we're falling into of M43 and all the rest of it. And actually, we should probably unpack what the SHMA means as well, because that's another piece of code as well, the strategic housing assessment, so that people understand what we're talking about. But you're suggesting that if someone has been funded through the Mayor of London, through the approved development programme, and they're promising to build 10% of a scheme of 150 units, should be fully accessible to anybody in a wheelchair, and then they're just not.
Yes, and I think again, we've talked about accessibility. It's not just wheelchair accessibility.
No.
I know in this particular conversation, by those standards, yes, but we are seeing the reality going through, and I know Sue will probably come in and talk about this in her experience, but we are seeing, once we're going to those properties and actually viewing them, there are lots of issues, and kind of independent kind of accessibility experts would not sign off on that. And I think this also comes back to inclusive design is absolutely paramount, and it's not acceptable just for local authorities to rely on contractors and architects who have no concept of inclusive design. And again, we're seeing that there are some new builds which have kind of, from our view, subpar accessibility features. Like, they'll get it right in the shower, but they won't get it right with the countertops. And
I mean,
for
would have
someone
thought
who's
that it would be relatively easy, given design standards are there and available for them to look at.
you would think that.
You would think that to produce what I might call a lifetime home, for example,
Yeah.
that anybody could move into at any stage in their life and stay living in, regardless of any sort of health condition that might happen or change, or no.
You would think
You
that,
would
but
think
that
so.
is
That's
not the case. And I know
Okay.
she's desperate to come in, but yes.
I was going to say, I think we might have to move on to Sue,
Yeah,
because
go
she's
for it.
very keen to come in. If we could do that.
I'm
Sue.
getting visibly agitated. I go to see some of the end finish on the inclusive access design panel. I see them at first proposals of the new builds, and they'll give us the spiel, and the access consultant might be in the room, but very often they're not. And then we don't have a chance to see it again unless we're invited to see the end product, so the post-occupancy. There's this holy grail of shared ownership thing, and very often, instead of us seeing the accessible social rent one, we're fobbed off to look at the shared ownership one, because the accessible social rent one isn't finished. And we've since discovered that's because they've got different contractor working on that one. So the standard and the parity of the basic fit is not the same. Yes, we expect it to be more luxurious for the market rent ones, but not to the point where functionality goes. I visited something that was about a £750,000 point of buying. I wouldn't move into it. The toilet seat didn't meet the edge of the bowl. It wasn't big enough for anyone over 80 kilos. The point where the sink was, the so-called towel rail thing that is attached to it, if you've got arthritic hands and you were trying to manoeuvre the tap thing, you'd be banging your hand against the actual towel rail. There was so much patterning that anyone neurodivergent wouldn't be able to move into it. The cross-patterning everywhere. Low ceiling, non-operational blinds. The kitchen counter, yes, looked absolutely wonderful, but you couldn't access the drawers because there was no handles. It wasn't a push-pull. The oven wasn't safe. I ended up, with all of my other disabled people covering a range of disabilities, standing in the middle of the room laughing and saying, this is accessible, even for someone with a lot of money. It really isn't. So if you have end finish like that, and the one that my son is in, within a year of him being in there, so many things were broken. That's why he wrote his report. The sensors were failing. They had the fire brigade out about 20 times within 2 months. The first 3 visits were free, and then after that it cost money. So I would ask the mayor to go back to the drawing board and insist that the standard is maintained for the MP, I can't even say that thing, MP4 and MP3. But what we're seeing is a fudging that 5% is adaptable and 5% is accessible. And in my mind, 15% of some of the larger joint venture builds should be accessible, because we have all the other types of disability that need to be housed. My son isn't in a so-called accessible unit, but has asked to be housed next to the disabled people so they can look after him and he can look after them. But you're missing the point of how you collect the data in the first place. You should encourage the mayor to look at the Bristol plan, where 300 co-producers have contributed to the One City plan through organisations like Autistica and other voluntary sector organisations. We have community representatives, experienced collectors of data living where I live, and they're not all doing the same thing as me. But for projects where you are collecting initial thing of types of tenure and types of things that are needed, then go back to source and train housing officers so they can actually do proper tenant audits, change those templates, put the monikers on local authorities to make sure those tenant audits are the point where they can, the person sitting there can say, no, I don't consider my firm accessible. What is it that you need? I had them changed, I thought, sitting on a housing strategy group, and actually it was diluted. So when I sat for my own tenant audit, we had to use a free text box at the end to reflect what I actually need to be rehoused in an accessible home. So how you do it is really important. And then going back to the thing of innovation, you see
Could I
a
just
piece
ask
of grant...
you, sorry to interrupt you, but
Yeah.
I just wonder whether or not having greater involvement from people with lived experience to get the co-production that you were talking about, whether or not people being involved in there's a mechanism that local authorities use at a very early stage, the design review panel. Which
Yes, that's what I sit on. But they go back on their word, and it's like for Ed City, we're supposed to have 33 social rented build, and they took 9 of them back in the second phase of the build to put into shared ownerships. So when you've got no monitoring of what's being built as it's being built.
So it's the subsequent changes as things
subsequent changes, and that's very common.
Back to the planning committee and say, oh, we just need to adjust so and so. So what's been agreed through the design review panel mechanism isn't necessarily then sticking for the whole of the life of the build.
Yes, because we see the pre-proposals. If we have things we want them to adjust, then they come back to us once more. But as I say, we only get in post-occupancy or as it's delivered to see very, very few. And there could be other people trained to do that. I'm now trained as an access auditor alongside some other people from Action on Disability. Those people could visit Enfinish to make sure that they truly are accessible, and before they were given to people, actually see that they're done properly.
But you are actually involved in Hammersmith and Fulham.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, because I have attended DRP, Design Review Panel meetings, for example, in Wandsworth. I represent Merton and Wandsworth. And I don't remember anybody outside of a very small group of council officers, and I'm not aware that they had particular training on, access issues or anything like that. Do you think it's common for? No,
I think we're modelling it, and when we've actually gone a little bit farther, we'd like to, as it were, sell at a very small amount of money, because we also have to make some money back, to other councils to do what we're doing.
Something to propagate elsewhere.
Yeah, but we are unique in that the developers pay us to sit there. They pay to the council pay us. We are payrolled. We're not paid enough in terms of the amount of time I spend on it, because I do extracurricular stuff. And the mayor, I'd like the mayor to link into things like Futures of London organisation, because there are some architects, a group of them, really trying their utmost to get things done. And they've produced papers on co-production, social value, housing and health, and I attend masterclasses with them. And they could actually lock me out of those, but they graciously let me in because our perspective is useful.
But I think the issue here is, I'm asking you questions about what could the mayor do, how can we amend the London plan, how can we come up with something that really works, and what you're saying is, well, it doesn't really matter if you come up with something in the first blueprint for a scheme, because as it sort of interfaces with the reality of the scheme being developed out, things get changed and they get kind of lost in the translation.
It needs more monitoring, more scrutiny.
And
then the room for innovation, because you see land and you calculate on that land how much you can build going upwards. But if you take away the right of a child to play at grass level, and that could be a disabled child, it could be somebody within a family who needs to sit outside because they can't attend an expensive sports class just for basic exercise. If you take that away from them, then you reduce the quality of life. So you need accessible housing, but there's a point where you compromise quality of life. And you've got so many empty buildings that could be adapted. So back to the first point, you've got empty garages, and I can't remember if it's Hackney, or there was an East End company that actually used garages and adapted them so they could become first homes, and that could be first homes for disabled people needing to move out of an overcrowded flat. And then you've got the whole thing of small pieces of land that you can put containers on. The amount of innovation that happens in other cities, and it is possible to do it in London, but the mayor needs to encourage more investigation of that by councils, by housing associations, because housing associations also have garages, also have empty properties. And as for feasibility studies and existing stock, our estate may be 100 years old, but we've got probably loft conversion possibilities. We need to see other feasibility studies that have been done elsewhere, so we need the mayor to investigate where it's been done properly and share the information cascade with us. And finally, I have a huge complaint against the site, which I believe links into the mayor, the London government one, where the information is out of date on social rent. They've got examples, 1 bed and whatever it is, and versus against buying. And that is only up to date to 2019//20. And there was a column that said social rent on it, and it's been removed.
Okay, we're kind of straying slightly from my
Sorry,
question.
I'm autistic and I will stray.
And I know that Laura wants to come back in, but I can feel Assemblymember Buff and Assemblymember Garrett getting cross because we're taking too long. But that was really helpful, and we've explored some very useful things that I'm sure we'll come back to when we're considering how to respond to the points you've raised. But I'm going to leave it there, and I'm sure your point will come up when Assemblymember Buff and Garrett are going to come in now. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, no, that was a full question and lots of ideas for the Mayor to take on there. And we'll be putting lots of those to our next panel, which is kind of GLA representatives. So, yeah, let's go on to Andrew Boff. And Laura, if you wanted to fold in your comment, that would be great.
Yes, I wasn't putting pressure on you at all, Assemblymember Cooper. I thought some of the answers were really instructive. I mean, perhaps to Ms. Vicinanza, would you be upset if, the GLA currently has an allocation for 3,500 accessible homes through its affordable housing programme. Only 350 of that, 350 homes have actually had an allocation from that budget. How upset would you be if they fell short in the long term because that accessible housing programme finishes next year? Well, of the 3,500 homes that were allocated, that was the target in the Mayor's accessible affordable housing programme. 3,500 were allocated to be accessible. Currently, only 350 have had an allocation, and it finishes next year. So, what would you say to that?
So we are actually quite concerned the accessible housing targets in the London plan are not being met by all boroughs. And what we have been saying, we would really like the Mayor to investigate why the accessible housing targets are so low. Just to give an idea, we've got 3% of approvals for accessible and adaptable homes instead of 90%, and less than 1% of approvals for wheelchair user homes, when we should have 10%. And what we've been asking the Mayor is to set up a task force, which should be chaired by Deputy Mayors of Planning and Housing, and should be made up by local authorities and also deaf and disabled people organisation. And what they should do is to investigate the reasons behind the lack of compliance with the targets, but they should also make sure that they also understand the wider barriers that local authorities are facing and providers are facing when it comes to building homes. They should share best practices, like my colleagues were saying. And if I can just come in on the point of inclusive housing design that Leonie was asking, we know, and I guess you can ask Albintec later, there are quite a few local authorities who don't have a very good understanding of inclusive housing design and accessible housing standards. They often don't understand the difference between, I know it is quite technical and I didn't choose to call it that way, M42 and M43, and actually they don't understand there is a difference between M43A and M43B. Apologies for the technicality, but there is a big difference between wheelchair accessible and wheelchair adaptable home. I want to highlight this.
Can I just say, I think on the planning front, your point is well made, and I think we've got a lot on that, but there was money should be allocated to provide 3,500 homes, and it hasn't been allocated, but for 350. I may be wrong on 350, I think it's 390 perhaps. I mean, that's wrong, isn't it, when the money is there to be allocated?
Yeah, definitely.
Definitely. And may I say, incidentally, your criticism of Schmar is like music to my ears. I don't think it hasn't met, it doesn't really represent real housing need in London. Something I've argued for quite a while. And so thank you for those criticisms of Schmar. I think it's a useless, virtually useless metric.
Can I just say it's not just the Schmar? I think if you look at the London Planning Data Hub and consequently also the annual monitoring reports, there's basically no data not disaggregated by tenure. So the GLA seems to be monitoring accessible housing starts and completion here, and then affordable housing starts and completion there, right? What we want is these targets to be brought together, to be aligned, and it can be done. It honestly can be done. It's a practical things that the mayor can do. And we know that most local authorities in their local plans are not making plans for how many accessible homes need to be affordable. So we think that the mayor should actually take the lead in that respect. And if I can add, currently, the 10% targets for the delivery of wheelchair user homes applies across 10 years. What that means is that you can build this kind of 10% across different tenures. You can build them for sale, you can build them for market rent, you can build them for affordable products that we know that it's not just social housing. You can also build them for like intermediate products, as Suzanne and Hayley were saying, right? At the moment, there is no guarantee that we're going to have wheelchair user homes specifically in the social rented sector because the 10% applies across all tenures. And actually what we've seen throughout our research is that developers end up building accessible homes, specifically wheelchair accessible homes, in more expensive tenures, but then they can't find people, of course, to buy these homes because they're too expensive. So this is something also I would like to add. So we would like...
In terms of I mean, this is what you've written to the GLA about. Are you content with the way in which you're currently consulted with by the GLA?
Okay, so the short answer to your question is that we are not really meaningfully consulted by the GLA on accessible housing. We had some members of the London Plan team coming to the London DPO Forum, which is a forum that the mayor set up a few years ago to make sure that DPOs can strategically engage with the GLA on a number of topics. But they stayed really briefly for about 20 minutes, and then they went. They weren't taking notes of anything they were saying. They explicitly said, we're not taking notes of your feedback, so for us, some of this kind of engagement or consultation, whatever we want to call them, it feels quite tokenistic to us. It feels a bit a tick box exercise. Also, speaking of consultation needs to be accessible. If you want to hear from disabled people, you need to make sure they are accessible. Just to make an example, the Towards a New London Plan consultation wasn't accessible. There were no alternative formats available, no easy read, no BSL version, no large print. How do you expect people to understand what your policy proposals are and respond?
That's actually quite shocking, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's actually quite shocking that the London Plan consultation wasn't accessible to all Londoners.
Yeah.
Would you mind, because I'm a bit time limited, so I'm going to ask Ms. Banish whether or not how you feel you're liaising with the GLA, or indeed if they liaise with you.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with Laura. We, as local, speaking as the voice of local deaf and disabled people's organisations that are borough-specific or area-specific in London, we are not meaningfully consulted at all. Really, we go through the Inclusion London DPO forum, and that is the only, if you can call it, consultation that we've had. I think there are a lot of disabled people, and there's a lot of disabled people's organisations that have, to a point earlier, that there are people on the ground who have views, who want to engage. I can give you an example of a WhatsApp group that we have of probably 30 local disabled people who I put a message out saying, tell me about your housing, tell me about what's going on for you. And I had like 100 responses in a very short period of time. So there are people who want to have a say, and they want to share their views, and they want to feed into the London Plan. But when it's not accessible, or there aren't opportunities for them to do that, then they don't, particularly accessible opportunities. So it's not even about the materials just being accessible, but it's about the way in which you share those materials. What are the pathways and channels that you're sharing those? Are those channels accessible? Putting just a singular post out on social media, I'm sorry, that isn't good enough, and that won't reach the people that you're wanting to consult with.
Thank you. And Ms. Eby, you want to chip in on this?
Well, Honestly, the Great London Authority, I rely on the translation from my local planning officers and from access consultants I speak to regularly, like Proudlock Associates, who actually did our training with us. We trained alongside our planning officers in parity on things like the whole thing of I can't say that thing, the MP4, MP3 thing. I wish to goodness it had a different abbreviation so I could get my head around it. But we were trained on that, and anybody that joins us on our inclusive access design panel, actually has an induction on that, and with any new planning officers. But we're starting to arm ourselves with more information, like I Go to the Future of London. I've also joined the Home Summit, Homes for Us, it's backed by the New Economic Foundation. And lots of people are encouraging residents to become unionised in their residents' association so they can better represent some of the disabled people who can't find their voice. I've got many people who could not do what I'm doing now, and many people who can't actually fight for what they need. They actually give up on changing their housing registration and all of the governance that goes with it. So for me, it's information cascade, and also there's a horrible culture of council-led things that are taking the information from the Greater London Authority, go, right, we're going to match these figures, we're going to do this and build that. And then they hatch their joint venture plans with other forms of funding, and then they actually pass their own plans, which actually isn't really legal. So, we've got something we may end up going to judicial review to block because it's flawed.
Thank you.
Badly flawed.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for all of these contributions. We are coming to our last question, but I just want to say at this point, if there is more that you need to say, but I'm sure there's loads more that everyone's got to contribute, we can have that as kind of written contributions. So, Laura, did you want to come in briefly?
Just a quick sentence. We want co-production. We don't want consultation, especially we don't want consultation after the decision has been made. Thank you very much.
Very well said. So I'm going to go over to Assemblymember Garrett for the last question. But yeah, do feel like you can continue to contribute.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the area I was going to ask around was how well you think the mix of accessible housing tenures meets the needs of deaf and disabled Londoners, but I feel like we've heard loud and clear what the answer to that is. In fact, though, I was going to ask a follow-up, which I think, Laura, you sort of touched on earlier, and I hate to delve back into this M41, M42, M43 business. Let's call them let's call them level 1, 2, and 3. That might make life a bit easier. So the Mayor's London plan says that 100% of new housing, not just affordable, across every tenure type, 100% of all new properties being built have to meet what I'm going to call level 2 for simplicity, and of that, 10% should meet the higher level 3. And you said earlier, we've heard that things that meet it, properties that meet it in theory don't necessarily meet it in practice when they actually appear. I'm going to ask the second panel about that. I've lost my graph now. What I'm interested in is that 5 years ago, 53% of properties were meeting that standard, the level 2 standard. And year by year, it's tailed off, so now it's gone from just over half to about a quarter. One of the explanations that I'm probably going to hear later, gazing into my crystal ball, is that this is due to the switch to the new method of tracking and recording it, the Planning London Data Hub. To what extent do you think it is because of this new way of tracking it versus we're just seeing lower delivery of accessible housing? I don't know if you have a view on that, Laura.
Well, look, from our perspective, if you've got targets in place, these targets need to be met, right? And it's up to the GLA to investigate the reasons behind the lack of compliance with their own targets, right? Yeah.
I suppose what they might say, I'm gazing my crystal ball a bit here, but what they might say is that they're not doing worse. The figures say they were doing badly before, and now they're doing twice as badly. What they might say later is that they think they're doing no worse, but maybe the way they're recording the data just suggests it's worse. So I'm just wondering, from your experience on the front line, as it were, does it seem like it's got dramatically worse, or that it has stayed about the same, or?
Well, for disabled people, the situation is still quite dire. So I haven't seen a lot of disabled people say, no, we can find lots of accessible homes, especially in the social rental sector. There are huge waiting lists. So But yeah, what I can say is that if there has been a change in methodology, you will still not see 3% of homes being approved. I don't understand how the change in methodology would suddenly make homes to approvals drop by 80%. I honestly can't really comment on that.
Okay.
I don't know if anybody else.
I agree. I share your suspicion, which is what I'll be challenging them on later.
But also, I think there is a huge issue with data, as we are saying. So it's highly likely that planning authorities and developers are not providing the right data, and they should definitely address this problem. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Did I see, I think, Suzanne?
The data is going to be flawed because some of the building are on large joint venture builds like Earl's Court. And that's a 15-year plus. And they're doing very well on the consultation. Some of the people sitting in our Inclusive Design Review panel are also in their PRIP, which I can't remember what that stands for, but something to do with public relations, public representation. And they're paid for that, so they're paying local people. And that when they sit with us, and they will sit with us more often, we do see the representative figures, but predominantly these are like window dressing projects. The percentage is there overall, like 51% affordable housing, broad stroke, but the actual social rented part of that is quite low. And then when you're collecting the data on completion at the different phases, I don't know where those figures are actually going. And what we're seeing predominantly in front of me in our sessions, when we do 10 sessions a year, is actually fancy co-living projects, which are built in Chelsea and compared with things that they've got one that's completed in Wandsworth. And they're all very lovely. They are got loads of accessibility features, but they're not affordable. I mean, they wouldn't even give us a sort of thing. I looked it up in Wandsworth. It's about $2,100 to rent. And when we asked them, could a disabled couple live in the accessible ones, they said, no, they're really built for one person. They're studio apartments with all this lovely communal living. But the reality is that most people cannot afford to move into them, aspirational they are, and people moving in and across the boroughs, changing jobs, their need for accessible housing isn't going to change, their disability isn't going to change. But if the kind of things being built are like at that level of rental, it's untenable. And many of the people I know that are relying on projects being built on their doorstep now, we've had to sit with them and actually do figures that actually show that they actually can't afford to move. They need to move, but they can't actually afford to unless either they earn less, so they're put within more support, or they earn significantly more. And I tell people not to rely on it. And I hate giving that message. So it is, and your previous question is, I'd like to swear, but I can't. I said, it's woeful. It's shameful that 3,500 homes are not going to, accessible homes aren't going to be delivered.
Yeah, I mean, the figures are poor, and there's no two ways about that, really. Oh, yes.
Can I just come in just to make a point around like that often the need, and Laura said this earlier, the demand for specific types of housing, the different levels, isn't really reflective, it's not reflected in what's. Sorry?
The accessibility levels.
Yeah, the accessibility levels. So for adaptable homes, for example, we are seeing a massive trend where people are put in adaptable homes and then they have to go through the disabled facilities grant process, which is not an accessible process by any means. It can take 1, 2, 3 years for those adaptable homes to be adapted to meet the needs. So if the homes were made to the highest accessibility standard, the wheelchair user standard, in the first place, people wouldn't have to then go back through this very costly, very demanding process, which often they can't do independently. And because we don't have data that actually reflects the needs of our communities, that kind of homes are being built arbitrarily, often for people who don't even end up using them and they get reallocated because people can't afford to buy them.
Yeah, that's an important point. So some of these categories, not to rehash the category discussion, but some of those categories don't mean that it's accessible. They mean that it could be made accessible. And as you say, you then move in and then you have to start a second project. Yeah, that's a very good point. Laura, you to finish?
Yeah, can I just make another point? Because we haven't talked about a big elephant in the room, which is developers. When we spoke with local authorities and we asked them, what do you think the barriers are in your borough to build accessible homes, they've mainly talked about developers to us. And so we can't underestimate that developers in London, because we're relying on the private sector to develop the homes that we need, and we're relying on Section 106 agreements. A lot of developers are actually arguing that it's not financially viable to build homes, not just that are affordable, but also accessible. And so they cut corners on the design of accessible homes. And you've got local authorities, on the other hand, who don't have often the skills, but also the capacity to actually go and challenge these viability appraisals, which are quite technical. So if I to say something is, also, we need to hold developers to account, and the mayor need to work with national government to reform the assessment process, because viability is profitability, and we really need to look at that.
Yes, thank you. You brought up something that actually was on my mind as well, the trade-off between different types of subsidy. So whether you're putting extra money in to make a property accessible, putting extra money in to make it affordable. Obviously, there's only so much money to go around. There's a trade-off between those, and actually, I wonder if that's the real explanation for the decline in the accessibility standards being met. My time is up, but if you had one very quick thing to say.
I'd just like to say, when I'm sitting in the room, developers are genuinely shocked by my level of knowledge. And of course, I helped actually review the design for the Mine Pass 6463, which isn't a statutory requirement, but it's a recommendation. We browbeat them with it, because we say if you make certain adaptations now in your designs and actually meet the levels to do with noise mitigation, light and other things, you'll make it more attractive for the other parts of what you're building. It'll be more attractive to your shared ownership scheme people and your market people. And we challenge them on everything. And they're genuinely shocked by that, because they don't expect to be challenged. And some people are making those changes. But we need to do more of what I'm doing across all the boroughs.
Understood. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, panel. We've come to the end of our questioning. I'd just like to say a huge thanks for everything you've shared and for everything you're doing. Lots of what you've shared has been incredibly shocking, and I know all of us will be looking forward to taking those questions to the next panel. So yeah, thank you so much for your contributions. As I said before, if there's more you want to share with us, do send it in for our investigation. We're going to have a short break and we'll resume for the next panel. Thank you. And welcome back to today's Housing Committee meeting. Before we get started, I'd just like to welcome the public health students from the University of West London who've joined us in the public gallery. Hello. Great. Great to have you with us. So we're discussing accessible housing today. We've just had a panel hearing around the experiences of disabled Londoners and the difficulties that they face. And we're now going to put these questions to our second panel. So moving from right to left, I've got Farah Manur, from the Head of Business Development, Centre for Accessible Environments at Habenteg. We've got Kate Gordon, Principal Strategic Planner, London Plan Team, Greater London Authority, so the GLA. Lisa Fermainer, Head of London Plan and Strategic Planning at the GLA. Velvet Dibley, Senior Policy Officer for Housing at the GLA. And Adam Driscoll, Housing Transformation Manager at the London Borough of Barnet. We've got a lot to cover, and we're going to do our best to bring you all in, but some questions might just be to specific panel members. So the first question comes from me. So what are your estimates of the current unmet need and projected future demand for accessible and adaptable homes and wheelchair accessible and adaptable homes in London? And I'm going to start with Farah, if that's all right. Oh, Mike. Thanks.
We know from the research that Habenteg has done that there's a huge unmet need for accessible homes. In terms of estimate, it's really difficult to get those numbers because there's a lack of consistent data coming out of the London boroughs. But we do know from the work that we do and the case study work and research we've done around the London plans, there's even the future need is really inconsistent as well. So we're really pushing for all of the London boroughs to not only have they already have the 90% adaptable homes and 10% accessible homes in their plans, but to also meet that need as well. That's the real inconsistency of this. And obviously I've read the Inclusion London report as well about how even having it on paper is not translating to real, actual accessible and adaptable homes. So yeah, I think that's a really key need if the GLA can push having that consistent data and also making sure that even if the homes are built in terms of accessible and adaptable homes, they're not going to the right people and they're being lost to the market. So that's another big need that I would say as well.
Great, thank you. Kate, would you like to come in?
In terms of housing needs, we're in the process of producing a strategic housing market assessment. And I understand that that's going to look at some of the levels of need. It may not look at all disabilities, but it will cover, I think it's going to cover some. That's my understanding. But we don't have the results of that yet.
Kate, sorry to interrupt you. I think we need to, could you move the microphone
of course, yes,
quite a lot closer to you? Because
no, I can move closer. It's fine.
Oh, brilliant. Or if you can move. No, well, maybe both.
No, it's absolutely fine.
I've got terrible tinnitus, so I struggle anyway with my hearing, but you're very quiet. Thank you.
Can you hear now? We're in the process of producing a strategic housing market assessment. My understanding is that's going to look at some needs for accessible housing, and I don't think it's look at all, across all the needs. It's not just about wheelchair access, all that's a pretty crucial standard. And we don't have the results of that yet, so I'm afraid we can't answer that question.
And is that looking at more than it has done previously, the strategic housing market assessment? Is it going to have more? Because we were hearing from the previous panel that it doesn't kind of capture a whole load of data that would be useful. So is it a kind of a development of previous versions? Is there going to be more in it?
I'd rather pass over to Lisa.
Great, yeah. Lisa, do you want to come in? Thank you.
Yeah, of course we expect it will. And the focus will be, though, on those elements that we can plan for, like wheelchair accessible homes are a very clear standard, but obviously there are other disabilities where it's less clear-cut how you might plan for them. Neurodiversity and noise, for example, long-term health conditions and the thermal comfort of people who may experience their housing differently. So some of those we will very much cover disabilities and what they might need in terms of housing in the next SHMA, and that's being worked on at the moment.
Great. And just anything else you wanted to say around how you estimate current unmet need and projected future demand? I know that was the original question. Sorry, we ended up on that specific one.
Yeah, again, that's something that's under development at the moment, and will set out projections for the need, including for wheelchair accessible homes. That will certainly be included in the next SHMA.
Velvet, do you want to come in?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess just for total transparency, so the strategic housing market assessment will feed into the next London plan, and as Lisa says, we're expecting that to take a more comprehensive look at the housing needs of disabled Londoners. Obviously, we know that there are gaps in the availability of this data. We really welcome Laura's report from Inclusion London, the Barriers at Home report, which start to look into that. I know that our housing policy team have worked with Inclusion London to kind of build on their research, and we're in the process of publishing a disability and housing research note that tries to look at some of that unmet need across, so it's secondary research, and we're looking across multiple data sources to identify what that unmet need is. We're quite clear that there is an unmet need, and we're hoping that the SHMA will support us in meeting that.
Thank you. I'm trying not to cover any of the other questions that we've got coming up later, because I know lots of colleagues have got things to contribute. Adam, do you want to come in on this first question?
Yes, so we recently completed a housing needs assessment in relation to our adult social care areas of work. So we have projections for kind of M43 and M42 standard accommodation through to about 2039. So it's a methodology that the Housing LIN has developed. And I mean, I'd be interested to know on the validation of the extent to the projections that that's putting through. But that says to us, for example, that M43 by 2039 we'd need 1,273, and on M42 we'd need 17,234. Properties. So a lot of this was targeting looking at the older adults age group, but when we look at that, it sort of suggests that the under 65s tend to need about 40% of the wheelchair accessible properties, and the over 65s about 60%. And then we do have some information about tenure split within that.
Yeah, that would be interesting if you want to share that.
Okay, so from a tenure split perspective on the M43, which I guess is probably a key focus for the committee, it was saying that for ownership was about 684 over the period, for social rent is 171, and for private rent is 417. So that's by 2039. If we were looking at a much more short-term period to 2029, we were looking at about 424 units for M43, and at least half of that coming from ownership, and then the about 139 for private rent and 57 for social rent. I was somewhat surprised by that, given that we know that we have 62 households on waiting for wheelchair accessible accommodation in our housing options service. So I guess that's where the validation perspective between the tenure splits is something I'm particularly interested to see developed.
And sorry, can you just comment on? I was going to ask if you were surprised, but also just how you got to those numbers.
It's the methodology that Housing LIN have developed, so I think we'd have to ask them over the detail of how those numbers were produced. I'm still waiting for the final report, but this was kind of interim figures that we had from February. I think the main point was that the forecast to 2029 that they were suggesting kind of matches the number of households we have in TA already needing a social rented wheelchair accessible property.
Thank you. I'm going to pass on to Assembly members. So I'm going over to Assembly Member Boff now for some more questions on this.
Just to carry on from what you've just said about the SHMA, who does the SHMA?
So the housing policy team lead the SHMA. You may have met James Gleeson, who's our housing research manager, and he leads on that. So it's not something that we outsource, we do it internally.
I'm non-criticised the SHMA, as Lisa will know, as a measure of desire rather than need. Could you undertake to ensure that those who are developing the SHMA pay attention to what was said in the first panel about the inadequacies of the SHMA from the perspective of disabled people?
Yes, definitely. I'm happy to obviously feedback from the panel members this morning within the policy team. I know that James has met with Inclusion London to discuss some of their concerns around the SHMA, and I know that he's also met with the London Housing Panel to discuss some of their questions that they've got regarding the SHMA. I think maybe one caveat to that is that there are quite strict requirements around how the SHMA is developed in order to kind of like retain, I guess, when the London plan is being assessed, the examination evidence, what do I mean, Lisa? The examination in public, the SHMA will be investigated in terms of how we've undertaken that, and the government sets quite clear parameters for how we do that. I know that James is looking to work within those parameters to see how we can address those concerns that would have been raised by the panel this morning.
Thank you. With regard to that first panel as well, our guests felt that the disabled people and organisations weren't adequately consulted by the GLA on accessible housing. What was quite shocking was to hear that the Towards a New London Plan consultation was not published in alternative formats. Is that the case?
So it was available in HTML and PDF. It was available for use with screen readers, for example, and that kind of technology. There was a BSL video that was published. There was that went through. There was in the vast majority of the about 50 events that we held had a presentation that very much followed the same format, so people didn't feel like they needed to go to more than one. We created a video version of that, and there was a BSL version, so that essentially ran through the content of Towards a New London Plan. So there was that. What there wasn't was an easy read version, similar, for example, to the ones that TfL produced for, say, Oxford Street, and we are currently producing that, and we'll run an entirely separate engagement on that. It wasn't possible to do that within the 6-week timescale and make sure we did that one properly. So that's coming at a later date, and we will work with the Deaf and Disabled Persons Organisation Network Forum, to make sure that there's good knowledge of that when that process happens.
So that deadline of yesterday for consultations is going to be flexed for those who are responding?
There's two things. Firstly, it will be a totally different process. We'll make sure that we do that separately. So that deadline is irrelevant because we haven't published the easy read version yet. That'll have an entirely different timescale on it. Secondly, any deaf or disabled Londoners who need more time have been invited to let us know, and we're negotiating bespoke timescales for people, deaf and disabled Londoners who want to submit.
I've also heard that large print may not have been available, or is that something that you would say was available?
There were no published versions of the document, so it was entirely online. We didn't print any copies of it. So to that extent, no, the large print didn't exist as such.
What was curious is that in talking offline to our first panel, they weren't aware of a BSL invite to consult. Perhaps that's something you could take away and look about how we're promoting that.
Yeah, I think there's quite a few lessons learned, I think, from the process of that engagement, and including, I think we we went through our internal forums and networks to try and ensure that we had the right representation and good breadth of representation, and that people were aware and able to consult. And I don't think that's worked as effectively as we would have hoped. And there are some communities who we haven't been able to engage with, for example, the deaf community. And that's arisen because people attending events said that they needed BSL interpreters, but they didn't. So we didn't use we employed a company to recruit people within certain communities. For example, we were lacking in faith groups, so we got the company to recruit specific people from faith groups. We didn't add the deaf community to that because we thought we already had representation, unfortunately. So we're going to have a look at that again and see how we can make sure that we get representation.
I mean, just one thing, I was warned off using the term deaf community by people who are deaf because the community is so diverse, and that tends to mean deaf community goes along with BSL. Some people who have difficulty hearing don't use BSL. So, but I hope there are lessons learned from this. Can I ask what the findings of the work commissioned by the GLA to understand the needs and gaps in housing provision for Londoners with mental ill health were, and how have they been used to shape the work in this area? Ms. Dibley?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have run a project commissioned by ourselves but funded by the Department for Health and Social Care, which looks at the need across London for adults with mental health needs in terms of the availability of specialist and supported housing, and also move on accommodation. We're currently working internally to understand how we're going to respond to those recommendations, but we expect to publish that report later this year. In terms of findings, it's hard to speak to specific findings, but in general, I think we're seeing that there's a lack of move-on accommodation available, which is quite common for supported housing, where they might need to step down in their provision, but there's nowhere for them to move on to. But we've been working closely with NHS colleagues to try and map that need as well. But the report won't be published until later this year. We're just working through how we can respond to each of those recommendations.
But we're going to see an in-data report about how that particular group is going to be provided for. Is that correct?
Yeah.
I think possibly from Ms. Munir, but somebody chip in, because this isn't a non-planning question, it's more a delivery question. How many homes that meet the M42 and M43 standards are you aiming to fund under the Affordable Homes Programme of 2021 and 2026? I think it might be Ms. Munir.
That's a question for Habinteg Housing Association, is it?
Sorry?
In terms of Habinteg, we've got a sort of modest development plans of about 100 homes.
Is anyone from the GLA here who can answer that, Ms. Dibley?
Yeah. So through the London plan, we have the 10% target for M43, and then the remainder of units should be M42. So as I'm sure you understood this morning, M42 is accessible and adaptable, M43 is wheelchair user, and that's broken down in terms of wheelchair adaptable and then wheelchair accessible. So accessible at the point of completion. 10% of homes should be M43. We don't have specific targets for schemes through this current AHP. I do have figures for completions on for the current AHP for 21-26. So completions so far for 21-26, there's 1,244 M42, so adaptable and accessible, and then 280 M43. At the moment, we're unable to disaggregate between M43A and M43B, but that's something that we could look at for the next programme.
So your original programme, or the original target, was to deliver 3,500 accessible homes by 2026, is that correct?
I don't know if we had a specific target for delivery through the HP. specifically.
Right, that's interesting. We might take that up offline because we've recorded that you did have such a target of 3,500 homes. Of those that you've given us the completions, what are the ones in process?
So I don't have starts and kind of pipeline to hand, but that is something that we can kind of follow up with after the meeting.
Well, better to come with the completions than the starts, to be honest, because you can't live in a start. Do you expect to see an improvement, however, on those figures by the end of 2026?
I wouldn't be able to comment on whether we're expecting a shift within the current AHP. I think what I can say is that given our commitment to boosting social housing delivery as a whole, we will expect those numbers to see an uptick in those numbers for the next programme. Obviously, the Mayor is really pleased to have seen the government spending review announcement for a 39 billion affordable homes programme. Our officers are working with government to try and get London's maximum share of that. We will definitely see an uptick in those numbers for the next AHP, as we're expecting the funding agreement to be more generous than the current one.
So you're expecting an improvement on the allocation in the next AHP, and part of that allocation will be targets for delivery of accessible housing.
So at the moment, we're still working through that agreement with government. I can't speak necessarily to targets within the next AHP as those discussions are still live. But I think in terms of raw numbers, we'll definitely be expecting to see an increase in delivery of accessible, affordable homes through the next AHP.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. I've just got a couple of follow-up questions there. Do you have those numbers of completions by tenure?
No, we don't actually. So I have spoken to our programme team and we don't have that breakdown by tenure. We do understand, obviously, the value of having that in terms of we know that there are affordability challenges for disabled Londoners. So where that's possible, we can consider what we could do in the next programme.
Yeah, I think, we heard that was really important. Mm-hmm. And then just as you were saying that the negotiations are happening with government on the next AHP, but obviously you've just said that you don't have the data about what the need is for. So how are you negotiating if you don't have the SHMA? I'm just a bit worried that when you're negotiating for the next affordable homes programme, I'm just wondering what need you're using to negotiate for the next AHP.
I think ultimately in our conversations with government, we'll be pushing for maximum flexibility. In terms of a local borough level, we trust that the boroughs have a best place to have that knowledge on local need to inform their delivery.
Great. And I was just going to say, that was going to be one of my questions, because we often hear that accessible and affordable are kind of pitched against each other, and the flexibility isn't there to provide the social homes that are accessible. So that's really good to hear that you're going for kind of maximal flexibility. For I can see that you want to come in, and then I've got a...
Yeah, I was just going to mention that we did a piece of work with the West Midland Combined Authorities, about 6 or 7 authorities, helping them assess their current need, a big piece around consultation. And then that ultimately went into a bigger report because they were really keen to develop their future policy and the work they're doing with developers locally and Homes England. What we found when we looked across those local authorities, the housing assessment need and the HEDNA as well, the housing economic data, what they were predicting themselves in terms of just looking at M43 and then looking at their local plans, it had by 50% underestimated what their need was. So there was a real mismatch in terms, and it may have been a data issue internally, so that was one of our recommendations to take forward. But it was great that they were doing that piece of work with us.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting, and we'll have a look into that as part of the investigation. Assemblymember Cooper, coming to you for your questions. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Chair. I'd like to come to Adam and then to Farah, if I may. This is about the Council House acquisition programme. And I just wondered to what extent that you feel that the Council House acquisition programme's grant rate of 200k per home impacts your ability to acquire accessible homes. I mean, and have you managed to, in fact, acquire any?
Thank you for the question. So we currently have an acquisitions programme. We actually deliver it through our housing association partner, Open Door Homes. So we have about 300 homes being purchased as part of the current programme. The grant rate is insufficient. So we have developed a programme which involves cross-subsidy. I mean, which includes subsidy from reduced loan rates, for example, to the housing association to keep it at the same level that the council would be able to purchase at. And we've also got right to buy grant and MHCLG grant, so combining that within a programme. But there is a substantial difference between an £85,000 grant and a £267,000 grant from MHCLG. And the difference being that it's very difficult to buy anything more than a one-bed unit on the current smaller grants, but the MHCLG grant at affordable rates can cover.
And amongst those one-bed units that you have managed to purchase, are any of them accessible?
No, so accessible homes are not part of that. Partly because it's a housing association. So they are buying houses and flats, but there isn't money for adaptation of the properties, and that would require Open Door Homes adapting the properties for specific purposes, and they don't have access to disabled facilities grant at the moment because that has to be applied for by the clients. So it is a challenge that we are taking forward into our new programme. At the moment, frankly, with delivering 200 homes, there is such a pressure around temporary accommodation that we're meeting the wheelchair accessible needs through new build programmes and also through the HRA stock. But absolutely, you'd want to see accessible homes built into the design of the grant rates for acquisitions programmes, as well as new build and council build directly.
So at the moment, the CHAP scheme in Barnet is not delivering on this front, it would be fair to say, at the moment. I'm going to ask Farah the same question, because obviously Habenteg is a specialist in this area. The 200k amount, is that helping you deliver anything at all in this area?
So Habenteg owns its own stock,
yes.
And then we do some work with some local authorities in developing, in building new homes. But what we do know is that in terms of existing stock, whether it's a council home or a private home, about 80% of them were built before any housing standards around accessibility were even there. So there's that question about could they be adapted, certainly for small adaptations possible, but certainly not for any larger ones.
So you're not working in partnership with any local authorities that are acquiring and then working with you to adapt?
No.
Okay. So that's a big no then, really, from both of you. What are the main barriers facing boroughs and also housing associations in increasing the supply of accessible and specifically wheelchair accessible homes? We've obviously just been touching on the issue of finance, but would you say that there are other barriers as well? And I'll start again with you, Adam, if I may, and then I'll come to Farah again.
Yes, certainly. Okay, so the major barriers, I think if I just took it in terms of what we see from housing associations, first of all, so what's the market delivering for us?
Yeah.
The challenge in that space is that the housing associations aren't brought into the development process early enough. Right. And as a result, they're not being designed into the schemes to deliver the right kind of accessible units. And that often ends up with the only units that come through from the housing association perspective being adaptable, not fully accessible units. So I think if there's one key change we'd really appreciate seeing is that much more early engagement and having a mechanism that drives the behaviour from the developer community to bring housing associations on board earlier. Because at the moment, I guess there's an advantage to creating more competition. And it's to get them to try and purchase the property, to lower the costs per unit, and therefore, because they'll only be able to rent them at a certain level based on LHA rents or social rents, and therefore, if you can drive the costs down, you make an additional profit on that. So I think that's an area that would be very helpful in terms of what the market delivers. Sorry, if you could just repeat the question again.
Well, it's really what are the main barriers to producing more accessible in general, but also specifically wheelchair accessible homes? And it seems that apart from money, because obviously we'd explored that a bit, and now you're saying that in the process of working together with partners, that the developers, private developers, I assume from what you're saying, are not involving the housing associations who would be much more focused on the social rented elements of a mixed development scheme, are not being involved early enough?
Yes. So, I mean, I think it depends on the scheme. So, of course, you get regeneration projects where there's strategic partnerships. You get areas where there are more strategic partnerships. But I mean, I think generally it would be very beneficial for delivering the right outcomes to have that kind of early intervention. From a council delivery perspective, we are designing all of our social rented units to be wheelchair accessible. We don't do adaptable because there is such demand and a need for it. So all of our new build, we're looking at the ways to kind of make that possible. And but actually, the council's own build programme is only a part of the development that's taking place within the area. And therefore, it's about how we get across all the different ways that homes are coming forwards for each of them to be delivering the accessible properties.
Sure.
Another area that we do see a bit of challenge around is units coming forward as shared ownership. I think it's been mentioned earlier today that instead of it being the social rent properties that come forward with wheelchair accessible units, it's shared ownership, adaptable or something like that, and therefore if there was a much clearer direction around tenure for accessible units, that would be very helpful as well from a policy
And is that because you would say that there's a greater need for properties at the social rent price point rather than buying a 25% share of a 900k flat?
I think from the perspective of public benefit and outcomes overall, it would make the largest difference to be delivering them as social rented or affordable rented properties that could then meet housing needs that councils have to deal with as well. And you know, ultimately we're working in partnership across the different areas of the public sector, and for us, our pressures around temporary accommodation are so significant that we really have to be delivering to meet those needs as a priority. And of course, we have to follow our housing allocations policy and the prioritisation that takes place through that.
Indeed. Farah, I just wondered if I could come to you. Obviously, you know, Habentag being a specialist, but what would you say are the main barriers to producing more accessible and wheelchair accessible accommodation that
well,
you're
I think
facing?
if the London plan is being followed by all the local authorities, that's great. So I think that's a challenge for the GLA in terms of the London plan is it actually being followed? And I think what you heard in the first panel was maybe not. Secondly, I know from speaking to sort of people who are involved in development in private as well as housing providers, sometimes some of those M43 units are in the private tenure mix, and that can be used because they're larger homes, they're more valuable in terms of a sales or a rent. But if you then maybe part of the GLA, you could put more of a mix into the affordable part of the housing development, so that would make them more accessible. But another big key issue is losing those homes in the market. So I've seen some planning conditions where the developer has given a year to market that home to the right people. And if they haven't, then they're allowed to then sell it off to somebody who doesn't particularly need that home. So I think there's a lot more that could be done in terms of making sure it's the right home that goes to the right people.
So what more do you think the GLA could do then to overcome some of those problems that you've just outlined? And do you think there's anything that could be done at sort of national level to support the boroughs and housing associations and the GLA, you know, to make sure that we are getting more accessible housing
We've always
produced?
advocated an accessible homes register. It's a
register.
Yeah. So people who need those homes know exactly where to go. And even the case study I gave of the West Midlands Combined Authority, people who had moved within the local authorities spoke about the lack of consistency around consultation with disabled people, and also the lack of consistency around the allocations and nominations teams not really understanding what their need was, and them going to see the wrong home, or not even realising that this home could be used. And I think OTs could be involved a lot more as well. OTs who have worked with those families, and then they should be part of that process in terms of looking at new homes.
Well, yes, definitely worth consulting an OT as to whether or not a particular property is actually worth a visit, because there's no point wasting people's time if, the home that they're going to go and look at is
absolutely
completely unsuitable.
The OTs know that family, they know their needs, but then they're left out in terms of the next process of when they're looking for assessing that home as well.
I used to administer DFGs at one time, and it was the queue to actually get an OT to come around and visit anywhere was it was one of the big delaying factors in DFGs. But I'm not asking you about disabled facilities grants. I'm just asking, and I'll come to Adam now. Thanks for that, Farah. What additional support do you think that the GLA could give both councils and housing associations to improve what we just touched on in terms of the amount of accessible homes that we're producing? And do you think there's anything that could be done from sort of government level to support the boroughs and housing associations in moving this on? Because I think from this morning and from now, I think we're definitely not saying that we're producing anywhere near enough, and there seems to be a number of reasons for that. But is there anything that the GLA and the government could do to help improve things?
Okay, so
your list can be as long as you like.
Well, one of the things, just while we were talking about DFG, is so having discussed with the kind of housing options team, we've definitely seen that the rules around how that works with housing associations is too complex. So that, actually addressing the way that DFG operates would make a big difference. Just giving you an example. It's that balance between you have to get the client there, the client has to lead it. Are they capable of leading that process to get their adaptations and being involved? And the void cost impact for a housing association of getting the right people there and then getting an approval for the grant. So, actually, there's something going wrong in all that process that needs clearing up.
I like co-production where it leads to improved outcomes, but I think the idea of somebody leading on the DFG process rather than OTs who know what they're doing, and also surveyors who can actually spec up the works. I mean, if I go to the garage, I expect the people who work in the garage to actually probably tell me what's wrong with my car. I'm not going to necessarily know exactly what it is, and I don't then expect to kind of lead the works and help them. I don't want a co-production. I want the garage to fix my car. And in one sense, aren't we really asking somebody to be involved in a process that, I mean, if they are a surveyor or they're a qualified OT, then fine. But otherwise, isn't that kind of a bit...
Well, I think that's the challenge, isn't it, that the process doesn't really work at the moment. So DFG is not providing an effective mechanism for getting those adaptable properties into full accessibility.
And of course, that, for people who are living somewhere...
Cooper, I'm just going to move us on from DFGs, if that's okay, if we could, and because we need to get on to some other questions.
I think keeping somebody in that place and improving it then might take them off the housing waiting list for something else accessible, which is why we've gone into that corner. But yes, is there anything else on your list? And there's three people from the GLA who are listening to you.
Are we going from a kind of a policy perspective in terms of the London plan that would be helpful? Or
start there. We've got another one about the London plan a bit later, actually. So yeah, just
leave things there.
Get an opportunity for that in a bit.
There's broader brush. Things that we need to be kind of engaging with is around, we have an ageing society, and actually grasping the fact that, we've discovered from our data work within Barnet that actually the amount of homes we have to deliver in the borough is broadly equivalent to the amount of the population is ageing by. It's an interesting question about how do we get to the point where every home is really going to be suitable for people to age into effectively? And I know we have the M42 standard, but actually how effective is that at delivering the right homes? And I guess that, like, I'm not going to be the expert in that side of things, but it really is about getting the baseline of properties to a level that's going to be able to support people, whether they have a blue badge and kind of partial accessibility issues, or they have a full wheelchair accessibility need. But I guess we can be very focused on that narrow group of wheelchair accessibility, but there's been a lot of conversation about the broader category of accessibility, and so we need to make sure we are tapping into both those kind of categories when we're thinking about how policy and other areas come forwards. I guess I can come back to things later, but broadly, what I was going to pick up on is that as a society, we need to decide within London, are we choosing between functional requirements or prescriptive approaches? And what are the right tools that are going to get us to better accessible homes? So, you know, how much is that trade-off of increasing floor levels so that we can have level access showers in every flat? As a society, are we willing to move that way? It's more costly if you've got to add an extra 25, 30 centimetres between concrete slabs at floor levels. It's more costly if you're going to have better circulation in every flat. But actually, would that raise the game? And how do we get to a point where that becomes the standard of how we're building all of our new homes? The trade-off being, of course, it's going to affect viability and affordability along the way. And so how do we use the other policy tools we have, whether it's grants, whether it's the standards, to kind of manage that process?
We've come back to money very quickly. I think I'm going to leave it there. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Over to Assemblymember Garrett. Thank you.
Thanks. Question to GLA colleagues, I think. And putting aside tenure types for a moment, and just focusing on new accessible homes of any kind. So a lot of the issues that have come out today, we've just been talking about, they're all spelled out in the 2021 London Plan. Policy D7 makes it very clear that ageing population, increasing need for disability access, and the policy that came out of that was that all new dwellings as of 2021 should be accessible. I'm not going to get into the weeds of M43 and M42, but all of them should meet one or the other, and 10% should meet the wheelchair standard. And yet, you know, back in the halcyon days of 2021, when this policy came out, we had 53% meeting the M42 standard, and 8% meeting the wheelchair standard, and those numbers have basically fallen year on year, all the way to the most recent figures, which I'm told here are 25%, so that's halved, and 2.6%, so that's sort of collapsed by, you know, 2/3, 3/4. So how is it that we have this policy that seems to say 4 years ago all the things that we've been hearing today, and yet the delivery of that policy, those are completion figures, sorry, I should have said those are completion figures. How is it that we've got a policy that says all the right things, and the delivery seems to meet increasingly none of the objectives? How have we got there?
My understanding of this is a lot of this is due to a move to a distant system of recording compliance. We moved to the planning data hub, and there's it's the recording of the homes, and that isn't happening in a consistent way, and we think it's being underreported. And I understand colleagues are working and liaising with boroughs to try and improve this.
Well,
so,
when did you start to think that was the problem?
I don't know. I mean, I don't directly work on this area,
okay.
So I
it's
can't
just because you see where I'm coming from. There's 5 years of year-on-year failure, or increasing failure. And was it year 1 or year 2 or year 3 where somebody thought there's a problem here, and here we are in year 5 or year 6, and we're hearing that it's tentatively, possibly this might be the problem, and we don't yet quite know what we'll do about it.
It is a completely new system, and we are, you know, we're pretty sure that the planning data hub, the new method for local authorities to report, the standards that, you know, of completions, you know, whether they're M42 or M43, we think the M43 and M42 is being underreported.
When did the new system come in?
I can't. I mean, you can find out.
So you did say it's brand new. So like in the last year or two. I'm not looking for a precise date. No. So over this period of the last 5 years, data.
definitely, I think, is within, yeah.
But why, I mean, what I'm driving at with my question about when somebody noticed is that presumably, let's say 2 years in, it had fallen from 53% to 36% meeting the M42 standard. At that point, presumably alarm bells rung that something was going badly wrong because the target is 90. At that point, presumably alarm bells were ringing, so maybe somebody looked into what was going wrong. And if what was going wrong was that we were meeting it in practice but not recording it, why are we now 2-3 years on and we're still not sure, and we're not sure what we're going to do about it?
I'll just pick that up. So I think that the issue is if every home should be at least the M42. And I think so obviously we implemented the system, we have the completions, we take a look. So there were a lot of teething issues for the first years, and we're obviously recording years previous, if that makes sense, not on the year currently in. So there's a lag that happens there, and then it takes time to resolve the difficulties. So going back to boroughs and saying, you're not recording this, one of the key issues is it's transferred to a system where when somebody submits a planning application via the planning portal, as in it has nothing to do with any of the local authority, it has nothing to do with us, that data goes live into the planning data hub. So in that respect, it's a beneficial system. But if they don't specifically tick a box that says they're built to M42 standards, the default is it will assume that they're not, when actually all homes in London should be built to M42, and that would be our expectation. So we're doing a lot of work with the boroughs to make sure, but actually the problem lies with the submission of the planning application in the first place, because if the developer who submits the planning application doesn't tick the box that they need to tick to say that all those homes are M42, it doesn't record. I think there's different issues around the wheelchair accessible or adaptable housing. But my colleague Kate just wants to come in. She's got a point here.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to clarify, 90% of homes should be M42 and 10% M43. So we know in terms of M43A, the lower standard and the higher standard, and it's quite an important distinction because the higher standard will mean a wheelchair user can go and live in the home, or most will be able to go straight away and use the kitchen, and there'll be a wet room, and they'll be able to use the kitchen sink, and it'll be at a different height, or they'll be able to get under the sink, which you need to if you're in a wheelchair. That you have room for your feet. We need room for our knees to go under a surface to be able to use the kitchen sink. But the reporting of M43 A and B is not local authorities just tick M43. And as Lisa said, you know, everything that's built now, the minimum standard of M42 is quite a game changer. It's pretty much similar to the old lifetime home standard that was being pioneered by Joseph Rowntree, you know, so 20, 30, 40 years ago. So it is quite a game changer and provides a minimum level of accessibility. And I think it's also, I hope you don't mind me slightly diverting the question, but it's also worth bearing in mind that in terms of planning, we're limited in what we can require in terms of the higher M43B standard, because that's a local plan policy can only require developers to provide the higher standard of accessibility where the local authority is responsible for allocating someone to live in the dwelling. Now, it doesn't stop developers from providing the higher standard, and some developers have done this, and I visited some schemes where this is provided, and they're beautiful flats, in the private, I think they were either shared ownership or for sale. But I think we've also got to think about where the homes are built, the neighbourhood, the development as a whole. That particular scheme has no blue badge parking, the local station's not accessible. And I'm not saying don't provide that accessible property, it's brilliant, but whoever lives there is going to be dependent on buses or happy to, you know, wheel 100 metres up the road or cross a busy road to park their car because of, you know, there's no immediate wheelchair parking. And the London Plan does require that, but for some reason that local authority chose not to require disabled parking at that development. So I think it's a much broader problem. And then for people with other disabilities, we're again limited on what the London Plan can require. And we are looking to strengthen the policy. I do understand that, but we can't commit at this stage because of the consultation, because of the different interests. When you're trying to meet multiple objectives, because M43 homes are larger, you then get into a situation that it might affect the rest of the housing mix of different number of bedrooms in the scheme. Yep. And so there are all those competing objectives, which is not to downplay that. I mean, I have a personal experience of trying to find accessible home to live in, and it's really, really challenging. Sorry, yeah, I'm going.
I will come on. You brought up the issue of a trade-off, which actually I was going to come on to, but I'm still really concerned about the fact that, so you're talking about what might be in the future London plan, the one that's still a year or two off. My concern is that, we have this policy in the existing plan, and I suppose, to be blunt, what I'm saying is, what is the point of setting a policy that sounds good on paper? I've got it here in front of me, policy D7, great stuff. We're nowhere near, we're not even in the same postcode as meeting it. We're literally 25% are the M42, 2.6, when they're supposed to be 90 and 10. So we're nowhere near it. We've been nowhere near it for years. We're getting further away from it as years go by. What I'm hearing is we're not sure if it's getting worse. It might actually be getting better or the same or worse, but not as quickly. We don't know because we've got this data quality issue that says we don't really know what's going on. And then what I'm looking at is that that's been going on for years, and apparently nobody has actually gone in there and said, what is going on? Like 2 years ago, 3 years ago, it was clear there was a problem. And what I'm hearing is maybe over the next months or years, this data quality problem might be fixed. But there's literally no point setting a policy if we have no way of capturing the data to see whether we're meeting the policy. It might as well not exist, and therefore everything else is sort of a waste of time. Am I being unreasonable?
Shall I answer? Yeah.
Well, I suppose that was a rantet. Let me put it in more concrete terms. When will we know that the numbers that are getting reported on completions of M43 and M42 are real numbers and not possibly just fake data put in by, inaccurate council reporting?
Well, what I can say is I know the team that's responsible for collecting the data that's monitored, that local authorities are submitting, is liaising with the authorities all the time to fill in the gaps. The new system, we moved over to the Planning Data Hub 5 years ago, and as Lisa says, there's a time lag. You've also got to remember when things get permission, it can be quite a long time before they're completed. So I think the quality of the data is almost certainly going to improve. So I can't give you a date when will we know, but because we've got this SHMAR, which is going to tell us what the need is for accessible homes, and that will then in turn underpin a future London Plan policy. So I think in terms of the reporting, the local authorities are generally going to be seeking to comply with the London Plan policy and with their own local plan, which has got to be in conformity with the London Plan. So I think the answer is the accuracy of the data reporting will improve. I think there's no question about that. It's as Lisa said, there have been teething problems. And as more and more new developments have to meet the requirements of M42 and M43, then the proportions will increase. That's inevitable.
I suppose my alternative hypothesis is that the data is pretty accurate and it's the performance that is utterly dismal. What evidence do we have that hypothesis is wrong?
I think I'm going to only speak anecdotally. I think inevitably there will be some developments that don't comply. I think that without question. But I think in general the proportion of developments achieving those standards is higher than it's being recorded.
I feel like we've reached a dead end on that, but it just feels to me very unsatisfactory that we've set a policy. We all agree it's a good policy. We're way off it according to the data, but maybe the data's wrong, and I don't know what. Maybe we could write, and maybe someone could write to us with what is the action plan to figure out whether the data is correct.
It's underreported. We've told you that it is wrong.
Sure, but
it's underreporting the proportion of new build that achieves M42. Absolutely.
I think we can take that. Take that away.
So then, let me come back to this trade-off that you mentioned, Kate, because I think that's a very useful question. So, again, an alternative hypothesis might be that as developers have come under more and more pressure to reach higher affordable housing targets, it is the accessible housing. There's only so much money to go around, and that might be one explanation for why the accessible housing is falling, because developers are being put under more pressure to reach the affordable housing and to use any available subsidy for that. Is there any evidence that might be what's going on? Because that seems like an obvious trade-off within the viability calculations.
I can't answer that question directly, but the provision, there are extra costs involved in providing accessible housing, especially once you reach, and in terms of the fittings as well, which then you have that national policy restriction that you cannot require M43B. So I don't know whether one of my colleagues wants to come in there.
Thanks.
I think I'd also note that if the priority is providing M43 homes at the ground floor, or particularly on lower levels, and we've heard a lot in our engagement about concerns about fire safety, PEEPs and those matters, that there is a preference for being, and even just broken lifts, there's obvious a preference for not being trapped in your flat because of issues there. And obviously the ground floor to upper floor ratio reduces as buildings are built in more dense environments. So that's something we're very mindful of as well.
Okay, thank you. And then
Assembly Member Garrett, we're going to have to move on in a minute if you've just got...
I've just got literally probably one question.
Okay, great.
So from your point of view, Adam, this business about signing off correctly and the work that's going on between yourselves as boroughs and the GLA, how we're making sure that that is correct, what sort of activity is happening. And let me just throw in a B. I said I have one question. Here's B. One of the points that we heard from the earlier panel was that property that is in theory signed off as being, let's say, M42, actually when you go and visit it might not be. So how do we make sure that that doesn't happen either?
Okay, so I think so I've asked the team in planning about the kind of data, because for the project of Right Homes, Right Places within Barnet, we were looking at, well, what do we know about what's actually been delivered? And they look back to the London Data Store. So I think everyone's looking to that as the place where the information is held. The challenge rightly is if the wrong information is inputted at the planning application stage, does that get picked up? Does a planning officer see every single box, every single word of very large applications when they're dealing with many applications at once? It is plausible that things have gone through. I can't speak for the planning department. I don't know if they could put in additional measures, but it sounds like it's an area that people have to work on of trying to find ways to make sure that it's being checked at the right time in the right way. I think something that you might be interested in thinking about is the fact that building regulations have changed 3 times since the London Plan policy came in. So actually every single application is being tested on the building regs of the time of the application. And that was one of the areas I was going to pick up today, which is, of course, you might have had an application that was approved years ago that is then being built to building regulations. Well, it can only be built to the building regulations of that time, and therefore enforced through the building control that way. And I think that's particularly relevant to why you might see kind of changes, or particularly people go around and say, well, why is this not accessible in the way it's expected? So I think that's probably relevant here. Was there anything else to your question?
No, I think that's a useful point actually about that, how you're sort of aiming at a moving target. So a new build actually might refer back to 2 versions ago of the building regs.
And particularly if you've got a scheme that maybe was approved 15 years ago, it might have even been before the London Plan or something. So multi-phase schemes will still go back to that original planning permission. And I think that's where I was getting at with the kind of prescriptive versus functional kind of systems that we operate in. And we operate that functional system, which is the minimum and above, and it will always be operating that way unless we looked at that more fire safety approach to things, which is a more prescriptive approach to how building control and planning processes work.
Okay, thanks very much, Chair.
Thank you, Farah. You did indicate to come in, and then I'll go to Assemblymember Baker.
Yes, no, it's just coming back on the point that you raised there. I mean, we work with a couple of London local authorities ensuring that the plans in terms of what they're saying in their access statement is actually right. And quite often we do need to go back to those architects and designers and say, well, actually this needs to be amended to make sure it's all compliant with either M42 or M43. And the other point I wanted to raise is that there is Southwark, for example, if the developers cannot build M43 for whatever reason, they charge them a penalty, a fee, basically, so that they can then go and build that somewhere else. So they're still trying to keep up that stock level of M43.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, that was helpful. Over to Assemblymember Baker.
Thanks, Chair. So I've got some questions about allocations, and so I'd like to ask Adam firstly, what's the process? How do you ensure that deaf and disabled residents in need of social housing are identified, prioritised and matched with suitable properties within your allocation system?
So when we're talking about the allocation system, that's very much in the Housing Options Service, the kind of role of Barnet Homes within Barnet, who is the ALMO that provides services on behalf of the council. So in that case, every household will have been assessed in terms of its priority banding. So is it a band 1, 2, 3 or 4 in terms of priority for access to a property. And then the wheelchair accessibility is being assessed under the local accessible housing register categories. So, for example, when we were looking at our numbers within Barnet, we found that category A, which is the full wheelchair access, there were 12 households, whereas category B, which is a partial wheelchair access, was 50 households. And then across that, we were finding that there was a majority of households needing 3 beds. So actually, when you look across the wheelchair accessibility needs of who's on that register, at least 50% of the households are needing those larger properties of 3 beds and 4 beds. And we know that it's really hard to get the system delivering them. So I guess one of the kind of things that would be quite helpful to come out of here is recognising it's already, from a grant perspective, very challenging to deliver larger units like 3 beds and 4 beds. And then you add the fact that actually we need 50% of our wheelchair accessible units to be those 3 and 4 beds. I think that would be a really... It might be a particular cohort of residents that are needing that. It's, I mean, I can see here about 28 households in the case of when I last took this data. But for those 28 households, the chances of properties coming through might be very difficult unless we were looking to adapt something within the stock already.
Thanks. Okay, that makes sense. In terms of other accessibility needs, how are those recorded? Are they recorded or are they dealt with while you're doing the allocation? What's the process there?
So I'm not a housing options officer, so I probably couldn't comment on the process in that kind of detail. But the information from that they previously gave me is that they're following that accessible housing register categorisation process for households when they're being assessed, and therefore households are ending up in a particular category to then be referred on with the occupational therapist to kind of look at whether the properties are appropriate. And the key thing is really getting occupational therapists being able to see the properties early so that you can get people allocated more effectively and understand where units have come forward with everything that you're expecting and as we've heard today, where units might suddenly have a problem. I can give you an example of a scheme that we've done recently where that might be of interest. So we purchased...
As long as it's quickly, the Chair says.
Sorry.
You can send other things in if
I think all I was going to point out was just the challenge of converting something from M42 to M43 and actually where, because we were needing to provide for more households in temporary accommodation, actually it was very difficult. We're talking £25,000 a unit to bring in level access showers and that, and the fact that only the ground floor units, because they had outside doors, could be used as wheelchair accessible units. But there were still households that had maybe a blue badge unit requirement, or we were using a walking stick or something, which meant they could still use maybe a floor above and still have that as an accessible property. But it's very challenging to deliver against that kind of temporary accommodation, that housing list of people that need placement. And you're always looking at, okay, well, this property, could that fit this particular cohort of needs? And then working down that priority banding. So you're first looking at priority ones, but does it fit with any of them? And then working your way down the bands.
Okay. Thank you. And to our representatives of the GLA, there's quite a lot of, well, there's a bit of inconsistency between boroughs, or, you know, about how they do those allocations. I mean, Farah mentioned previously accessible housing registers, but I think we've only got about less than half boroughs operating those. So it seems that there could be a bit of a postcode lottery for deaf and disabled Londoners in terms of exactly how they navigate getting the right allocation. What could the GLA do, or how does the GLA support boroughs to prioritise and allocate accessible social housing to disabled and deaf and disabled Londoners?
So I'm sure, as the committee knows, the Mayor doesn't have a statutory role in allocations. I think if boroughs were to collectively approach the GLA and suggest that there really was a space for us to take a role, we would be receptive to that. We understand, and I know that Adam's spoken to this, there are so many different demands on housing waiting lists and how they do their allocations that make it really, really challenging. I think in terms of the Mayor's role, ultimately, housing officers don't want to place a family that doesn't need the accessible unit into that accessible unit. Boosting the supply of affordable housing in general should start to minimise those pressures, so that people aren't placed in those sort of situations where that unit isn't being used best. So that would, I think, be our main approach.
I mean, yes, of course, more social housing is the answer to so many of the questions we discuss in this room. But so at the moment, there isn't anything that the GLA specifically does to sort of help share best practice or anything like that.
So we have, and this was developed under the previous Mayor, but we have the London Accessible Housing Register.
Yes.
Whose name is slightly misleading because it's more of a set of resources that boroughs can use, and we know that a couple of boroughs do use this to categorise their stock that enable improved allocations. So where you have M4 1, 2, 3, this has kind of more granular categories, allows you to identify which property meets that and then allocate properties more effectively, so you have a more granular breakdown of what the need is of that person, and then subsequently which property they could be placed in. I think so. Those resources are available on the GLA's website. I do understand that there are kind of practical barriers in terms of assessing all of your stock against this checklist, but that is something that's available to boroughs if they wish to use it, and I know that some still do.
I mean, is that something that's still being updated, that accessible housing register? We may have.
So it's not currently being updated.
Right.
I suppose we're not often approached by boroughs with requests to. I think we know that Tower Hamlets and RBKC are also using this, and we haven't been approached before with a request to update it. It's, I suppose, at the borough's discretion as to whether they find it helpful to them, but we know that some do.
So it's really sort of, if there was more of a demand from boroughs at this stage, that's something that the GLA could look at doing more
Definitely.
on, but at the moment that's not.
Yeah, we don't hear much discussion from our partners regarding the London Accessible Housing Register, but if that were to change,
or sort of coordination or best practice or anything really at this stage.
Not really.
Okay. Back to you, Chair.
Yeah, there was just the question at the end about the locator. You got that one? Yeah? Do you want to ask that one?
Apologies, sorry, I may have been getting confused about different tools, but there was specifically an accessible and specialist older persons housing locator, but that doesn't seem to be still available.
I'm actually not aware of the locator tool, so I can take that back, but I'll have to come back to you on whether that's still available, but I'm not currently aware of it.
That would be great, thanks.
Yeah, Kate.
Kate, right.
I'd also just like to highlight there's also an issue about a lack of knowledge of where the accessible housing is in the private sector. I think we've heard that quite high proportion of disabled people do live in the private sector. I know the proportion living in social rented housing is higher than the general public. It's around 30% compared to about 10% in London. But I think that this lack of understanding about where the new build accessible homes are, existing accessible homes are for private rent or private sale is quite not offering a solution, but it's an issue, and it's partly why we end up with a situation where a developer does provide the more accessible and the higher M43 standard, whether it's M43A or 3B, that after a period of time it gets lost to the market. To general needs, anybody can move there, and so that lack of knowledge. And I'm not offering a solution, sorry, but it's an issue, and it's part of. And I think if that were there were more knowledge around where that provision is, that could possibly ease some of the pressure on the social sector, where people go on a list because they cannot find an accessible home, cannot afford to buy or privately rent. But if they find one, either in the existing stock or new build, then that would make things much easier.
That's a really interesting point, because obviously, yes, we've heard that the majority of accessible housing really does need to be social housing and affordable housing. But effectively, there doesn't seem to be much of an incentive for developers to provide accessible homes if no one's going to be able, who would be interested and might be able to afford it, can find where it is. That seems to be a big gap, I suppose. Is that what you're getting at, Kate?
It is. It's about the existing housing too, and I just think we need to take care about the need. There is a vast need in the private sector for accessible housing too, particularly with the older population, but not just because of that, because prevalence is higher among the over 65s with disability. But at the same time, I would say that there's a lot of new build specific retirement schemes are going to be accessible, and so tend to be accessible because of the client group. So that's I think the gap. There's this massive gap for disabled people sort of under 65 too. So and that mustn't be forgotten. And some of those will be there is a significant need within the private sector too. So I think we mustn't forget that. And perhaps it's easier to control and provide in the social rented sector because you can, because you've got that control about the allocations potentially that's lost in the private sector to a large degree, especially for existing homes, and when they get sold. And I've come across examples where they're marketed for conversion to larger properties, because they'll have big space standards. And somebody I came across a property clearly built to M43B, probably about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, being marketed for a landlord for an HMO or something, to say, you can easily make this into a 3 or 4 bed or something. So I think we need to be aware of how can we work to try and better match what's out there with those that need it in both sectors.
Thanks very much. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you. And will some of that be covered in the SHMA then? Is that kind of dynamic that you were just describing? Because that would be incredibly useful.
I don't know is the answer. I know it's going to look at the needs, and I expect it, but I don't know for sure. Maybe they'll know whether it highlights the mismatch between what's existing and
I think that would be really helpful.
And what's needed.
I've just got one question left. I'm aware we've only got a few minutes, but this is for Adam and Farah, because I did promise Adam the opportunity to say what was needed from the London plan. So this is your opportunity to say which specific policies or provisions would you like to see included in the new London plan to better support the delivery of accessible homes. And maybe, we're running short on time, so if you can just do some top priorities.
So the three things I was going to suggest was we need to drive a design approach that ensures the buildings and the floors below a certain height are delivered in a way that doesn't create downstream costs for making the units accessible. So it's recognising that vertical, the slab-to-slab distances, so that you've got that space for level access showers. And we really ought to be driving towards level access showers being a standard. That might be an M4 2+ or whatever it is, but we can get into all kinds of numbers. But actually, that was £16,000 per unit to get that in. And if your slab to slab ratio is too narrow, because there are developers that build at 2 and a bit meters, and if you think of your IKEA wardrobe, that's 2 meters and 5 centimeters is the minimum one. So if you unless the developer's building at 2.4 metre ceiling heights, which is only going to be the luxury end of flats, you're not going to find the space to put in a level access shower in most units. So that slab to slab is a kind of a key area. The horizontal side of things, we have to think about, yes, you've got the fire safety challenge of lifts and refuge areas and all of that, which comes with the kind of accessibility factor, but also the circulation within the properties. And it's great that someone who is allocated a property that's wheelchair accessible could have one that has better circulation. But what about if you wanted to date someone or have a partner who has wheelchair needs, and your flat is just a livable accommodation? How are they supposed to stay over if the door frames aren't the right width or there isn't enough circulating space for a wheelchair? So I think it's about that being on a journey towards all homes at least being able to work from an accessibility perspective. Other countries do level access showers as a matter of course. It's just we have a thing about baths in this country, but it's also cheaper for developers because of that floor to ceiling height. So really thinking about the fixed parts of a construction process, the added cost that you're building into that, the impact that has on affordability, because we can't just suddenly go there if we're actually trying to drive up the number of homes that are getting delivered and delivering more affordable homes. But what's that journey that we need to go on?
Great.
And then, yes, I picked up the point about housing associations shaping the design of schemes. And the other one is recognising through social housing grants that there are additional costs. And it really is the way it combines when you look at the tenure, the size of the units, and then the accessible needs. And you can't deliver all of those things. So we need to have a grants programme that enables us to manage all those different factors.
Absolutely. Farhad, have you got any comments on the next London plan?
Yes, I was going to suggest if it hasn't been implemented fully for the last 4 years, I could certainly make a recommendation to maybe even go beyond the 10% on the wheelchair accessible homes. But I think the more pressing need is the implementation and the training of possibly a knowledge gap in the planning team or getting an access consultant or a housing colleague, if they have one in their local authority, to be part of that process to really ensure, and if they're not building those accessible homes, to have some form of a penalty, just like Southwark has that penalty. So I think the more pressing need is the implementation and the data collection around the next plan.
Yeah, I think that is the underlying factor of that question, isn't it? Because obviously we had that conversation earlier about having the recommendations in place. We've come to the end of the panel. I know we've covered a wide range of topics. I really appreciate all your contributions. There was a bit of kind of gaps in some of the answers, so we might follow up on some of those. And we're obviously producing, we'll feed back on this discussion. So I'd just like to thank all of you for your contributions and asked the committee to note the report from today. Can we note the report from today's discussion? Is that what I'm asking?
No, you. Yes, you know the report, the agenda report.
Oh, okay. We know the agenda report.
And then you know today's discussion.
We know today's discussion. And can you also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with group party leads to agree any output arising from today? And can you note our committee's work programme and our meeting dates as agreed in the London Assembly at its annual meeting on the 6th of May 2025 and the additional activity undertaken, namely the informal meeting on the 21st of May? And our next meeting is on the 10th of July at 2025 at 10 a.m. in the Chamber. There's no urgent business, so I declare the meeting closed. Thank you.
The broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.